Are we working? Yeah, we're working. Let me grab my chair. So, we got the Feast of Unleavened Bread coming up. Mama Joe asked me to have somebody do a teaching on leavening and what we need to get out of our house. I've been struggling with this ever since I came to the walk in the last couple of years when I've been working on Passover, and Deborah and I, okay, what do we get out of the house for leavening? It's the first time I was ever asked to really focus on it. And rather than assign it to somebody else, I figured I'd do it. So the first thing I did is I grabbed a hold of the passage we're looking at, Exodus 12:15. For 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread, but on the first day you shall remove dough with yeast from your house. For whoever eats anything with yeast from the first day until the 7th day, that person shall be cut off from Israel. Okay, so me being who I am, first thing I do, interlinear Bible. Let me find out what the Hebrews say. You shall eat unleavened bread. See if I pronounce this correctly. Matzah. Is that close enough? Yeah. Unleavened bread. So I look it up. It's Strong's Concordance 4682. Unleavened bread or cake. Okay, got that. I'm reading from an NASB, so I jumped to that real quick. And in the NASB, it's unleavened bread. It's unleavened 15 times. It means unleavened bread 10 times. Unleavened bread 25 times. Unleavened cakes 3 times. So it seems to always be something to do without yeast. Everything I could find on matzah. So the bread I've got to eat is without yeast. Or in this case, leavening is how we translate it. But then in here it says, remove dough with yeast. That was my translation in English. But when I was looking in the interlinear, I find that word is sehor. And I read that in leaven. It just says leaven. Yeast in their day and age. So my word search hasn't helped me much yet. I'm trying to figure out, okay, well, what do we mean by leavening? Well, y'all know me. Well, some of y'all know me fairly well by now, so you might have guessed where I go with that. First thing I do is go, okay, Mr. Computer, leavening. And this is where I start, if we're going to be legalistic, this is where things start to cause us trouble. Back in their day, yeast. That was it. That was it. Yeast. In our day, you might be surprised. Baking soda and baking powder, right? Those are leavening. Well, we got to get them out of the house. When are you going to quit picking and choosing what leavening is that you're going to get rid of? Because I also found out that in our modern age, we use air as a leavening, where you beat egg whites into a cream. That's a leavening. So we're going to get eggs out of the house. And then I found out we use steam in certain products as leavening. Well, that's water and air. Are we going to get those out of the house too? And we also use carbonated water as leavening in our world today. So I quickly realized that if I'm going to get all legalistic with just leavening in an English dictionary sense, I'm not going to be able to live because the water and air have to go for a week. I can't hold my breath that long, brothers and sisters. So I'm like, okay, that didn't help any, but I kept looking. I wanted it, sodium bicarbonate, and I found out that was known to the ancients. They used it in concrete. But I found out that, the first use of that in bread as a leavening was in the 16th century. So I'm starting to suspect that maybe the scriptures are talking about something other than just leavening. And I read about baking powder. And that's, I don't need to read the chemical composition of that. All I cared about is first use here was in the early 1800s. So if I'm supposed to think it's any and all type of leavening, I got to be careful with that, because otherwise Yahweh's word seems to move as we find different ways to leaven bread. So I started looking for somewhere else in the passages of the scriptures where I could find help with what we mean by leavening. Leavening sin, right? I know about that. I've been taught that. Matthew 13:33 presented me with a problem. He, being Yeshua, spoke another parable to them. The kingdom of heaven is like leaven, which a woman took and hid in the 3 sata of flour until it was all leavened. Well, leavening meant sin in Exodus, but here it means it's being compared to the kingdom of heaven. So I'm starting to suspect we're dealing with metaphors here, right? Matthew 16, and I'm going to read this whole passage, verses 5 through 12. This will help us a little bit here. I'm starting to zero in on what it is I was asked to teach on. And the disciples came to the other side of the sea, but they had forgotten to bring any bread. And Yeshua said to them, "Watch out and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees." And they, the disciples, began to discuss this among themselves, saying, "He said that because we did not bring any bread." But Yeshua, aware of this, said, "You men of little faith, why are you discussing amongst yourself the fact that you have no bread? Do you not yet understand nor remember the 5 loaves or the 5,000 and how many baskets you picked up? Nor the 7 loaves or the 4,000 and how many large baskets you picked up? How is it that you do not understand that I did not speak to you about bread? But beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees." Then they understood that he did not say to beware of the leaven of bread, but of the teaching of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. So leavening here is teachings. Sin, kingdom of heaven, and the teachings of bad teachers. It's a metaphor. Right there I have my passage. So what is the metaphor dealing with leavening with the Feast of Unleavened Bread? And I was wrestling with Yahweh on the way to the studio one day, and he says, "Well, you know what the difference is here, Joe?" He says, "Yeast is alive. And if you have just a touch of it in a dough, it will eventually permeate the whole dough. So if you have a touch of the sin in your life and you don't deal with it, it'll take over your whole life. If you have a touch of the kingdom of Yahweh in the world, it will take over the whole world. You put a touch of bad teaching in your world and you don't sort it and test it, it's going to lead you astray." Baking soda. If I have my 3 measures of sata and I only put a touch of the baking soda in there, that's all it'll leaven. It's dead. It won't get the whole batch. Same thing with baking powder. Same thing with air and water and every other form of leavening we use. But the one that'll take over on its own, like it has a life of its own, is yeast. So I think it was just grabbed because that's what they had. It was a way for Yahweh and Yeshua to communicate to Yahweh's people. Deal with the sin in your life. So unleavened bread is using something that is concrete and material in their world to teach us, tackle the sin in your lives. Change. Cross over, a new way of living. Get this stuff out of your life. Be radical about it if you have to. Cut off your hand, gouge out your eye. Well, that's ancient Near East hyperbole. I doubt he actually means to maim yourself. What he's saying there is as radical a change as you need to do it. If you need to go out into the desert like John the Baptist to stay away from the temptations, off to the desert you go. Honey and locusts are pretty good food, and you don't have any leaven in any of that. So I'm sitting here thinking, okay, I think I got this down. It's going to be about getting the yeast out of my house. Not because the leavening's the sin, but because it's a physical manifestation where I'm saying, okay, I can see this tangibly, something my physical body can get to teach me the spiritual lesson. Get the sin out of my house. Deal with it radically. So radically that I'll throw anything with leavening in it outside of the house for a week. Get that sin the heck out of there. And I'm saying, where do I find affirmation of some of this? 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 6 and 8. Your boasting is not good. Do you not know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump of dough? Clean out the old leaven so that you may be a new lump, just as you are in fact unleavened. For Messiah, our Passover, also had been sacrificed. Therefore let's celebrate the feast, not with old leaven, nor with the leaven of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. More metaphor. He's telling us to be a new man. Live as new people. So for me, when I finally had to look at this, I realized it's not about the actual thing. Although it is, in a way. You need something that you can show yourself and Yahweh, showing your obedience, that shows a material focus of the lesson that's trying to be taught. Get the sin out of our lives. Change, become new people. Get the bad teachings out of our lives. Grow the kingdom. All things that tend to have their own life, if you want to use that metaphor, if you let them be, they tend to have their own power, their own life on us. It's saying you get a hold of it. Don't let it rule you. You rule it. Rule the sin in your life. You reign over it. Another passage that just popped into my head. I know a guy who slays his brother and then tells Yahweh, I can't handle that. And Yahweh says, sin's a crouching lion at your door. It'll get you unless you get it first. So he's telling Cain, you can fight against that sin in your body. Passover, that's what it's about. Get the yeast out of your world. Now, we turn this into legalism in a lot of cases. Be careful with that. We taught a lesson today in Sabbath study about working out our own salvation. So if it is in your conscience that baking soda and baking powder are leaven that you need to remove from your house as well, do so, by all means. But don't come legalistic with your brothers and sisters that don't share the same mind with you. If all they want to remove is yeast, be good with that and let it go. If it's sin to you, that's Romans 14:23. But the one who doubts condemned if he eats, because he's eating is not from faith, and whatever is not from faith is sin. In other words, if you're going to think that it's going to be sinful not to remove the baking soda and baking powder, then remove it. But at the same time, it's not for you to force that on others if their conscience doesn't do that. As long as they're removing the yeast, I don't see a problem with that. You work out your salvation. You let your brother and sister work out theirs. But at least get the yeast out of your house, because that is clearly defined in Scripture. And also it's the metaphor. So yeast can't be the bad thing, because what's the kingdom? It's bad teachings. It's a metaphor for the new man. It's just a way of talking to us so that we can understand it. In a simple way. Simple message from our Father so that we're not going to have a hard time putting it into the practice in our lives. So I know you missed a good part of it, sister, but hopefully this will address what you wanted. And for those that heard it, simple, easy teaching. Sometimes we being humans like to think it can't be that simple, but yeah, grace is. We just go looking for ways to make it harder, because we seem to think, if it's a pearl of great price, it's got to be hard and expensive. Not always. Sometimes the hardest part is just saying, thank you, Father. That's all I have for y'all. Who's praying us out?